It is 334 BCE, and Alexander crosses into the Persian Empire. By 331, after Issus, after Gaugamela, after a chain of collapses and surrenders and political turnovers, he has basically broken the empire's core. And I know the default answer here, because it is the answer most of us inherit. Alexander was brilliant, his army was excellent, Persia lost key battles, and that is the story. And look, that story is not false, it is just maybe too complete too early. Because if you sit with the timeline for even a minute, it starts to feel strange in a way the heroic version does not really explain. Persia is not some small state caught flat-footed. This is the Achaemenid Empire, pronounced Achaemenid, one of the great imperial systems of the ancient world, a state with huge territory, huge resources, and a lot of experience ruling over distance. So the question that kept bothering me was not, did Alexander win battles? He did. The question was how an empire this large starts feeling, within just a few campaign seasons, weirdly reachable. How something that big becomes penetrable that fast. That is the first tension here. Not heroism exactly. Speed. Because if the conquest moved that quickly, then either Persia was much weaker than it looked, or we are missing something important about what Alexander was actually moving through. Hi, and welcome to Backtested by Oren, because this is where the usual version of the story starts feeling a little thin. Because the more you look at Persia as an imperial system, the less it looks like something that should have been easy to crash through. Herodotus describes a royal road running from Sardis, pronounced Sardis, in the west to Susa, pronounced Susa, deeper in the imperial core. And he is not describing some vague road heading east into the distance. He is describing stages, stopping points, guarded territory, and a courier system built to keep royal communication moving in all conditions. Now, to be careful, the exact numbers are messy. Ancient totals do not line up perfectly. Modern reconstructions differ. Scholars argue about branches and alternate routes. So this is not one of those cases where we can pretend we have a perfect ancient transit diagram sitting in front of us. But the larger shape of the thing is pretty clear. Herodotus gives a normal travel time of about 90 days on foot for the Sardis to Susa journey. Modern summaries often put that corridor at around 2,600 kilometers, and there is a long tradition of roughly 111 staging posts along the way. And once you hear that, I think the conquest actually becomes more puzzling, not less. Because this empire had not just conquered space, it had spent generations trying to solve space, or at least make it governable. Roads, relays, stations, treasuries, administrative hubs. A whole political culture built around the assumption that the king's order could move. So now the question shifts a little. It is not only, why was Alexander strong? It is, why did Persia's own connective infrastructure not make him slower? This is where the story really started changing for me, because once you compare message speed to army speed, the whole thing starts behaving in a way that is, honestly, kind of weird. The long tradition around the Persian relay network is that dispatches could travel the Sardis to Susa route in something like 9 to 12 days. Not 90, 9 to 12. And that makes sense, because that is what a relay system is for. The point is not that one rider gallops across the whole empire. The point is that the message keeps getting handed forward, horse to horse, rider to rider, station to station. But an army cannot do that. An army moves as itself, and that means men, animals, baggage, food, command, morale, all the heavy, real things that make force possible also make it slow. Modern estimates often put Alexander's average march in the rough neighborhood of 24 kilometers a day, which means that if you run army movement against a corridor of something like 2,600 kilometers, you are not looking at 10 days. you are looking at something closer to 100. And that creates a very strange imperial problem. The center can, in theory, know something from the western frontier about 10 times faster than it can physically move power to answer it. Now at first, that sounds like an advantage. And it is an advantage, obviously. Fast communication is a form of power. But only up to a point, because once a state gets used to fast communication, it also starts building expectations around fast communication. And that means the next question is not just how quickly Persia could hear bad news, it is what kind of politics, and really what kind of habits, a system like that teaches people to expect. Because if messages move fast, then orders move fast. And if orders move fast, then waiting for the next order can start feeling completely reasonable. This is where I want to slow down a little, because there is a lazy version of this argument, where Persia becomes a cartoon of bureaucrats frozen in place until a letter arrives. And that is not what I think the evidence supports. But the administrative record, especially around Persepolis, does point to something important. Travel and provisioning were regulated. Authorized travelers carried documentation. Rations were controlled. Stations mattered. Records and receipts fed back into the center. So the road is not just dirt and stone and horses. It is bureaucracy made physical. It is permission moving through geography. And it is also, maybe, a little dangerous under invasion. Because now imagine you are a local official and the frontier starts shaking. What exactly are you supposed to do? Do you burn stores before orders arrive? Do you empty a treasury? Do you abandon a major city? Do you destroy infrastructure the king may want intact later? Those are not small improvisations. Those are regime-level decisions. So the point is not that Persian officials were passive or stupid. The point is that a system like this may well train expectations around recognized channels, recognized authority, and recognized orders, especially once the stakes get large. And suddenly, another layer of tension appears. Maybe this is not only a story about movement. Maybe it is also a story about hesitation. Not cowardice, not incompetence. Hesitation inside a system that has taught people to trust the next official signal. Now go back to the campaign itself. After Granicus, pronounced Granicus, the invasion is already starting to look dangerous for Persia. But then Sardis enters the story. And this is one of those moments where the familiar conquest narrative starts slipping a little out of alignment. Because Sardis is not just stormed and ruined and left behind as a symbol. Arrian says the commander Mithridates, pronounced Mithridates, surrenders the city, the Acropolis, and stored money. And what Alexander does next is, I think, the interesting part. He appoints a governor. He keeps tribute flowing. He preserves the fiscal surface while changing who controls it. And that is not a decorative detail. That is a clue. Because it suggests Sardis is not just a city sitting on the western edge of the empire. It is a functioning interface. Treasury, fortress, tax flow, regional authority, all bundled together in one place. And once I started looking at Sardis that way, I could not really go back to the simpler version of the campaign. Because now the question becomes, if Sardis matters as more than a city, if it matters as a switchboard, then how many other famous stops in Alexander's advance are hiding that same kind of logic? This is where the map starts behaving differently. Take Gordium, pronounced Gordium. People remember Gordium because of the knot. And I get it. The knot is the part of the story that survives because it is cinematic and portable and myth-friendly. But think about it for a second. In the middle of an invasion, are we really supposed to believe that the most important thing happening there is a symbolic performance with a legendary knot? Maybe, but maybe the knot survived because legends survive, while the strategically important thing was much less romantic. Gordium is a crossroads in inland Anatolia. Routes converge there. West starts becoming interior there. Then move to Tarsus, pronounced Tarsus, and the Cilician Gates, pronounced Cilician. Now the campaign stops looking like a row of dots on a conquest map. Now you are looking at corridors, passes, handoff points, places where movement from one zone feeds into another. And once you see the map that way, Alexander looks a little less like someone simply collecting victories, and a little more like someone getting onto the lines that make the empire coherent in the first place. Not every captured place is equally important. Some places are cities. Some places are interfaces. And if you capture the interface, the surrounding territory can start changing behavior, even before you own every inch of it. Now imagine this from the king's side, because I think that is where the whole thing becomes easier to feel. A report arrives from the west. Maybe a city has flipped. Maybe a fortress has changed hands. Maybe the road is still open, technically, but no longer comfortably open. And that is the cruel part. The Persian system is good enough to deliver bad news quickly, while still being far too slow to reverse events physically at the speed of an army. So the court gets visibility before it gets control. It gets the shape of the crisis before it gets the means to close it. And then things get worse, because once forts fall and key nodes go hostile, information does not have to disappear to become less useful. It can arrive late. It can arrive by detour. It can arrive shaped by fear, rumor, stale assumptions, or the local commander's best guess about what the court wants to hear. This is why I think some of the modern metaphors can actually get in the way here. It is tempting to say Alexander was intercepting packets or running some kind of ancient intelligence thriller. Maybe fragments of that happened. The sources do not really give us a clean version of that. What they do give us is something more structural and, honestly, more persuasive. If an invading force sits on the same corridor space your empire relies on, then the network does not need to go dark to start failing. It just needs to stop being predictable. And once that happens, the question changes again. Not just what the king knows, what everyone else thinks the king knows. And this is, I think, where some Persian decisions begin to look a little less mysterious. Not admirable exactly, and not disastrous because everyone involved was incompetent either, just more understandable inside the logic of the system. If you live in a state where official communication is usually fast, then waiting for the next message can feel perfectly reasonable. The next order, the next clarification, the next assignment of authority, the next theater-wide command decision. Like the elevation of Memnon of Rhodes, pronounced Memnon, into a broader coordinating role in the coastal war. That is what centralized systems often do under pressure. They pull decisions upward and then try to push them back down in a more legible form. And that works until the corridors carrying that legibility start wobbling. Now go back to the local level and imagine what that uncertainty feels like. You know the empire is large. You know the king can normally hear things quickly. You know orders usually move. But now the map is changing faster than the old confidence can keep up. So do you act independently and risk being the official who overstepped? Or do you wait and risk being the official who waited too long? That is a brutal kind of uncertainty, because by the time the right answer becomes obvious, it may already be too late to make it. why is there no instantly coherent Western countermarch after the early shocks? Well, because fast orders are not fast concentration of force. Why do important places sometimes flip with critical assets still intact? Maybe because the people making those decisions are still acting inside an accountability culture where preserving imperial assets feels more legitimate than torching them in advance. And maybe, too, because if messages normally move in days, it is very easy to believe the center still sees the map more clearly than you do. Until, all at once, it doesn't. Up to this point, you can still tell the story as one of disruption. Alexander moves fast. Persia's communications become less reliable. Coordination starts degrading. Fair enough, but there is one more turn. And I think it is the most interesting one. Alexander does not just seem to break the Persian system. He often steps into it. At Sardis, tribute continues. Administrative logic continues. The surface of rule is preserved, while control shifts underneath it. And I need to be precise here, because this is where it would be easy to run ahead of the evidence. The fully safe claim is that Alexander repeatedly takes over existing administrative centers and redirects their functions, rather than replacing everything from scratch overnight. The next claim, that this would also let him exploit the permissions, payments, and provisioning structures that made long-distance imperial movement possible, is a strong inference, but it is still inference. What is not inference is the pattern. Administrative centers keep mattering. Treasuries keep mattering. Governors keep mattering. Tribute keeps mattering. Which means Alexander is not behaving like someone who only wants dramatic battlefield victory and then chaos behind it. He seems to understand, whether explicitly or just operationally, that if you can hold the interface, a lot of the surrounding landscape starts behaving differently, and that gives you a very different picture from the one we usually inherit. The heroic version says the empire collapses because the great captain keeps winning. This version says the empire starts losing coherence because the great captain keeps getting his hands on the parts that produce coherence in the first place. Still, once you say that out loud, the whole campaign looks different. This is not just conquest as destruction, it is also conquest as takeover, a hostile claim on an already built operating system. Persia had already done the expensive work of binding distance together. Alexander did not need to invent a rival network while invading. He needed to capture enough of the existing one that the empire's own connective logic would start answering to him instead. So, was Alexander's deeper advantage bigger than the battles? I think the careful answer is yes, but only if we say it carefully. The battles mattered enormously. Granicus mattered, Issus mattered, Gaugamela mattered. The battlefield still decides a great deal. But the battlefield alone does not explain why Persian space became progressively easier to penetrate, harder to coordinate, and easier to repurpose politically. Infrastructure helps explain that. The Achaemenid Empire had built roads, relays, stations, treasuries, and official channels that made governing enormous distance plausible in the first place. That was the strength. That was the sophistication. That was what made this empire feel governable at scale. And then an invader moved directly onto those same lines. He captured junctions, he let administrative surfaces continue where it suited him, and he benefited from a system built for coherence and then turned that coherence into leverage. The legend gives you the knot. The history underneath it may be giving you the crossroads. The legend gives you the conquering genius. The history underneath it may be giving you a commander who understood, or at least exploited, the relationship between roads, decisions, and time. Persia was not undone only by force arriving from outside. It was also exposed, gradually, by the very architecture that had once made it powerful. The roads were not a mistake. They were one of the empire's great achievements. But under the pressure of invasion, the same network that made the state fast and governable also made it dependent on those qualities staying intact. And once the wrong person started standing on that network, the strength began turning into a weakness.